Imagine the peak of human civilization, the Roman Empire at its absolute zenith, an era known as the Pax Romana. It is a gargantuan organism, stretching from the fog-choked forests of Britain to the burning sands of the Euphrates. Millions of people, dozens of cultures, all held together by a single, terrifyingly efficient legal and military machine. And at the very top of this pyramid sits one man. He is the Augustus, the Imperator. To the millions who have never seen him, he is a living god. His face is the only thing they see on their coins. His statues stand in every forum, tall, serene, and invincible. He has the power to erase a city from the map with a single stroke of a pen. He is the master of life and death. Now, move the camera, leave the golden palaces of Rome, and travel to the cold, muddy banks of the Danube. It is 3 a.m. Inside a cramped military tent, the air is thick with the smell of wet leather and oil lamps. The god is not sleeping, he is shivering. He is hunched over a small table, his fingers cramped from the cold, his stomach churning with a chronic illness that has plagued him for decades. He isn't writing a military strategy, he isn't counting his gold, he is writing to himself. He is writing a manual for his own survival. "Everything is fading," he whispers to the papyrus. "The people who praised you yesterday will be dust tomorrow, and you will be dust with them. Why do you still care what they think?" This is Marcus Aurelius. To history, he is the Philosopher-King. But on Deconstructing Minds, we aren't interested in the statue. We are interested in the man who was breaking underneath it. This isn't just a book of wise quotes. It is a 12-book transcript of a lifelong battle against depression, isolation, and the crushing weight of absolute power. We have spent 2,000 years treating the Meditations as a self-help book. Today, we perform a psychological autopsy. We are going to find the human being who bled behind the purple robe. We are going to deconstruct the man who had the whole world at his feet, but spent every night trying to convince himself that it was okay to wake up tomorrow. To understand the adult emperor, we must first deconstruct the child. Marcus was not born into the imperial line. He was an orphan, a boy from a noble but not royal family. But he had the misfortune of being noticed. He was spotted by Emperor Hadrian, one of Rome's most brilliant but also most mercurial and terrifying rulers. Hadrian was a man who travelled the world, executed his rivals, and obsessed over perfection. He looked at the young Marcus and saw not a child, but a tool, a project. Hadrian gave him a nickname that would become a psychological prison, Verissimus, the most truthful. Think about the weight of that. Psychologically, this is the birth of what we call the gifted child trauma. From the age of 6, Marcus knew that the most powerful man in the world was watching him. He knew that his only value lay in his truthfulness, his purity, and his wisdom. He wasn't allowed to have a childhood. He was manufactured to be a messiah. Hadrian forced the current emperor, Antoninus Pius, to adopt Marcus as part of a complex, multi-generational succession plan. Marcus didn't choose to be emperor, he was assigned to the throne, like a soldier is assigned to a suicide mission. At age 17, when he was told he was now the heir to the throne, Marcus reportedly broke down in tears. He didn't want the palace. He wanted his books. He wanted the quiet life of a scholar. But the Verissimus trap had already closed. He had been told for a decade that his duty was his only identity. This created a massive internal rift, a split self. There was the public Marcus, the stoic, perfect, dutiful leader. And then there was the private Marcus, the boy who felt like a fraud, the man who was terrified of failing the enormous expectations placed upon him. His Stoicism didn't start as a philosophical quest for truth. It started as a desperate psychological armor. He needed a way to numb the pain of losing his own life to the state. He didn't choose Stoicism. He used it to survive the person he was forced to become. Before he became the frozen statue of the Meditations, Marcus was a man of intense, almost desperate emotion. We know this because of a stroke of historical luck. His private letters to his teacher, Marcus Cornelius Fronto, survived. If you read the Meditations, you see a man who says, "Do not be moved by affection or grief." But in his letters to Fronto, we see a completely different human being. He writes, "I love you so much, it hurts my chest." He writes about his terrible cough, his aching limbs, and his heavy-headedness. He sounds like a sensitive, anxious student who is terrified of disappointing his mentor. This is the pre-Stoic Marcus. He was naturally hypersensitive. He was prone to deep bouts of sadness and physical fragility. Why is this critical for our deconstruction? Because it proves that Stoicism was not his nature, it was his cure. He realized very early that a man as sensitive as he was would be destroyed by the Roman court. The court was a nest of vipers, a place of public executions and cold-blooded betrayals. To survive, Marcus had to perform psychological surgery on himself. He had to amputate the parts of himself that needed love, the parts that felt fear, and the parts that felt physical pain. When you read his famous lines about staying unmoved like a cliff in the sea, you aren't reading the words of a man who was born strong. You are reading the words of a man who was born a sandcastle and spent every waking hour trying to turn himself into stone. The Meditations are the sounds of the hammer hitting the chisel as he tried to carve a god out of a very tired, very sick human being. To be the Emperor of Rome was to live in a state of constant sensory and social assault. Imagine the Roman court, a labyrinth of marble corridors where every echo is a potential threat. You are surrounded by thousands of people every day, but you are not with them. You are their target. Every smile is a petition. Every handshake is a hidden agenda. Psychologically, Marcus Aurelius lived in a state of hypervigilance. He was a man who deeply craved silence and intellectual solitude, yet he was forced to preside over the grand theatre of the empire. He developed a profound, almost visceral hatred for the public spectacles of Rome. He loathed the gladiatorial games, describing the cheering crowds as a swarm of flies, and the blood on the sand as filth. To survive this, Marcus developed one of his most famous psychological tools, the inner citadel. He wrote, "The mind is a fortress. If you retreat into it, you are safe from the storms of the world." But let's deconstruct what that actually means. In modern terms, Marcus was practicing a form of systematic dissociation. He taught himself to be physically present in the Senate or at a banquet, while his mind was miles away, contemplating the cosmos. He used a technique he called the view from above. When the noise of the crowd or the petty bickering of his generals became too much, he would imagine himself floating thousands of miles above the earth. From that height, the Roman Empire is just a tiny speck. The wars are just ants fighting over a crumb. The insults of his enemies are just silent vibrations in the void. While this allowed him to stay sane, it came at a devastating cost. Depersonalization. To keep from being hurt by people, he had to stop seeing them as people. He began to describe his fellow humans as puppets moved by strings, or smoke that vanishes. He looked at the purple imperial robe, the ultimate status symbol, and reminded himself it was just sheep's wool dyed with the blood of a shellfish. He looked at a fine dinner and saw a dead fish and a dead bird. By stripping the world of its beauty and its human warmth, he became invulnerable to disappointment. But he also became a ghost. He lived in a self-imposed psychological exile, a man who possessed the whole world but refused to let any of it touch his heart. He stayed a good emperor, but he became a very cold human being. If the world was a theatre of the absurd for Marcus, his marriage was the most difficult act he had to perform. His wife, Faustina the Younger, was the daughter of his predecessor, Antoninus Pius. Their marriage was not a union of love, but a political merger, the final stitch in the tapestry of his succession. But history, or at least the rumours of history, was not kind to Faustina. The Historia Augusta and other ancient sources are filled with scandalous accounts of her infidelities. They claim she took gladiators as lovers, that she frequented the docks to sleep with sailors, and that she even participated in a conspiracy to overthrow Marcus in favour of a rebel general, Avidius Cassius. Whether these rumours were entirely true is almost irrelevant for our deconstruction. What matters is that Marcus knew the rumours. He was the most informed man in the world. He lived with the knowledge that he was being mocked in the taverns of Rome as the cuckold emperor. A normal Roman emperor, a Caligula or a Nero, would have responded with blood. They would have executed her, her lovers, and anyone who whispered the story. But Marcus did the opposite. He publicly defended her. He thanked the gods for such a compliant and affectionate wife. After her death, he even deified her, building temples in her honour. Why? Was he truly that enlightened? Or was this the ultimate example of cognitive dissonance? Marcus practiced a radical, almost pathological form of forgiveness. He told himself, "No one can hurt your soul except you." He believed that if Faustina was unfaithful, it was her problem, not his. But imagine the internal pressure of this repression. Every day he had to look at the woman who had, perhaps, betrayed his bed and his throne, and he had to tell himself, this is indifferent, this does not matter. This is the social mask at its most extreme. He chose the stability of the empire over his own ego. He famously noted that if he divorced her, he would have to return the dowry, meaning he would lose the political legitimacy her family name provided. Marcus sacrificed his dignity as a man to preserve his duty as an emperor. He suppressed his anger, his jealousy, and his shame so deeply that they disappeared into the fortress of his mind. But a fire suppressed is not a fire extinguished. It simply burns the person holding it in. Marcus Aurelius was a man who lived in a state of permanent physical breakdown. He was what the Romans called a valetudinarian, a person of naturally weak constitution. His personal doctor, Galen, describes a man plagued by a sensitive stomach, constant chest pains, and such severe insomnia that he often spent the entire night pacing his tent. But there is a darker, more clinical layer to his stoic calm. To manage his chronic pain and his crushing anxiety, Galen prescribed him theriac. Theriac was a complex, universal antidote, but its primary active ingredient was a massive dose of opium. Marcus took this drug every single day for the last decade of his life. Modern medical analysis suggests that the doses were significant. When we read the Meditations, we are often struck by its surreal, dreamlike quality. He writes about the world as a river of fire, a spinning dream, and a fading shadow. While we credit this to his philosophical genius, we must also consider the pharmacological influence. Marcus was a man presiding over an empire-wide graveyard, while his own senses were muffled by opiates. His apathy, The Stoic ideal of being unmoved may have been, in part, chemically assisted. This doesn't make him a junkie in the modern sense. It makes him a man in a desperate situation. He used the drug as a psychological buffer to tolerate the intolerable. He was a man fighting a war on the Danube, a war in the Senate, and a war against his own biological pain, all while moving through a haze of Galen's medicine. He stayed on the throne because he found a way to numb the agony of existence just enough to keep his hand on the rudder of the ship. If Marcus Aurelius's life was a theatre of duty, the Antonine Plague was its most horrific act. In 165 AD, Roman soldiers returning from the east brought back a silent, invisible killer, likely smallpox. It was an apocalypse in slow motion. At its peak, the plague was killing 2,000 people a day in Rome alone. By the time it was over, nearly 5 million people lay dead across the empire. For the emperor, this wasn't just a political crisis. It was a total psychological trauma. Marcus did not hide in a palace. He stayed in the city, presiding over the burials. He saw the carts piled high with rotting corpses, the filth of the earth, as he called it. He watched as his closest friends, his generals, and his citizens withered away. The smell of death was the background of his daily life for 15 years. How does a man survive seeing 10% of the world die? Marcus used a psychological defense mechanism called systematic desensitization. He began to talk about death with a cold, almost surgical indifference. He wrote, "Death is just like a flower blooming or a leaf falling. It is a natural process of the universe." But look deeper. This isn't just wisdom, it's dissociation. To stay sane while walking through a graveyard, Marcus had to decenter himself. He practiced the cosmic perspective. When the sight of the dying became too much to bear, he would zoom out. He told himself that human life is a point in time, and our substance a flux. By making human life feel small and insignificant, he made the pain of losing it feel smaller. He retreated into the view from above to escape the horror on the ground. He became a man who could look at a mass grave and see only nature changing its form. He saved his mind, but he did so by becoming a stranger to the very humanity he was trying to protect. He was a gravekeeper in a purple robe, convincing himself that the rot was just physics. Every psychological deconstruction must eventually confront the subject's greatest failure. For Marcus Aurelius, that failure has a name: Commodus. For nearly a century, Rome had thrived under the adoptive system. Emperors chose the most capable man to lead, not their biological sons. But Marcus broke this golden chain. He appointed his son, Commodus, a man who would grow up to be a narcissistic, bloodthirsty tyrant who believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. Why did the wisest man in history make the most disastrous decision for Western civilization? From a psychological perspective, this was Marcus's last human emotion. After a lifetime of suppressing his anger, his grief, his pain, and his desires, the only thing Marcus couldn't stoicize away was the biological drive of a father. He fell victim to a massive cognitive bias, the halo effect. He saw the potential for goodness in his son because he needed to see it. We must also consider the psychology of exhaustion. By the end of his life, Marcus had been fighting wars and plagues for 20 years. He was sick, he was tired, and he was likely drifting in a fog of opium-based medicine. He didn't have the strength to amputate his son from the succession. He chose the natural path of a parent over the logical path of a Stoic. This was the ultimate irony of his life. He spent years mastering every impulse of his mind, yet his most significant legacy was fueled by the very thing he taught against: irrational attachment. In the end, the iron mask of the emperor cracked, revealing a tired, dying father who simply couldn't say no to his child. It was his most human act, and it was the act that ended the golden age of Rome. He mastered the world, but in the nursery of his own palace, the will won, and the Stoic lost. In 180 AD, in a cold military camp near modern-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius finally met the change he had been preparing for. He was likely dying of the very plague he had fought for so long. His skin was grey, his breath was shallow, and his friends were weeping around his bed. Marcus looked at them with his tired red eyes and asked a question that perfectly encapsulates his deconstructed psyche. "Why do you weep for me? You should be weeping for the world." Even at the moment of death, he was performing. He refused to be a man afraid to die. He had to be the Stoic who welcomed it. He died as he lived, in a state of total emotional self-censorship. He spent his last breath reminding everyone that he didn't matter, that nothing mattered except the order of the universe. Marcus Aurelius was the man who won the war against himself, but lost the world. He showed us the true cost of duty. He was a boy who had his childhood stolen, a man who had his health ruined, and a father who had his heart broken 8 times over. He used philosophy not to find happiness, but to endure a life that was objectively a nightmare. We don't remember him because he was a perfect god. We remember him because he was a breaking human being who decided that, no matter how much it hurt, he would stay at his post until the end. He was the most powerful man in the world, and all it cost him was his soul.